Well, greetings out there in Facebook land and in alternative venues for jazz land. I'm very pleased to be able to get together with you, virtually speaking. It will, of course, seem a little one sided to me, but I'd like to thank Gail Boyd, my good friend, and someone that I have worked with as a manager and as a booker of things and a general co-conspirator in all things jazz. I'd like to thank Gail for inviting me to do this. So, without further ado, I'm Laurence Hobgood. I am a pianist, composer, arranger, producer, educator, Yamaha artist, and all-around musical investigator, you might say. Perhaps it's true that I'm best known for my writing and arranging work, but in my life, I place equal amount of importance on playing. I have a couple of different ensembles that are currently suspended, just like everybody else. But the main core of that is my trio with the great drummer Jared Schoenig and bassist Matthew Cloessy. So I guess I'll sort of begin at the beginning a little bit. That was how it was suggested might be a good approach. So I have been incredibly fortunate as an artist. Both my parents were in the arts. My father was a fairly well-known theater teacher, actually pretty famous theater teacher in academia. He founded the program that's still one of the best thought of, most renowned theater programs in the country, especially outside of New York or LA, at Southern Methodist University in Dallas, Texas, where I grew up in part. And while he was teaching, the 11 years we lived in Dallas, which was from about 1964 to 1975, I studied classically, private lessons from, I guess that ends up being kind of first grade all the way through junior high school, classical music. Some light competition, but I didn't really distinguish myself in the classical world at all. But I learned a lot, and as I found out later, which will maybe be part of this story in a few minutes, was fortunate that I didn't really learn that many bad habits, especially technically on the piano. So when I was 15, my father accepted. I should mention too. My mother was a great Appalachian folk artist, singer, dancer, and quite an authority about Appalachian-oriented literature. So that was kind of this. I grew up in this. My Cuban friends, Cuban musician friends, have a word Oaxaca, which is a soup. It's how they describe the melting pot of musical influences down there. And I grew up in a real kind of a Oaxaca of music. Listened to everything from classical music. My uncle, my father's older brother, was fairly famous Nashville agent, handled even Elvis at one point, Johnny Cash, Tom T. Hall, Donna Fargo, Sonny James, long list of people that Uncle Bob handled. So there was a lot. I heard a lot of country music in the house, obviously Appalachian folk music, and also Miles Davis, Dave Brubeck. One of the real blessings of my life was that I grew up listening to Dave Brubeck and then later had the good fortune to become friends with Dave. So I always used to want to mess around improvisationally with the classical pieces that I was playing. My classical teachers did not always appreciate that very much. So there was an improvisational bent from very early on. I started sort of taking tunes off the radio by ear, pop tunes. I grew up on the pop music of the everything, especially after 1965 through the 70s. That was very present in my life, even after I got into jazz. So in 1975, we moved to Illinois, Champaign-Urbana, Illinois, University of Illinois, and that was where things really sort of changed for me. The first few months that we lived there, I didn't really play that much. Getting used to a new social situation, 15 years old, difficult times. My interest in classical music, it's safe to say, had been waning a little bit. And so my father, in his wisdom, said, maybe this kid's not going to be a classical pianist, and he seems to have this improvisational leaning. So I ended up having lessons with a young new faculty member there in jazz, and that just sort of took over. Although it is worth saying that when I actually did get into college, one of the most important things that ever happened to me was that I studied classically again, and I studied with a brilliant British pianist on the Illinois faculty named Ian Hobson. Ian was and still is known for having really amazing technique, and he taught me a technical system that has to do with very slow practice and accessing muscle memory through deconstructing what has to happen physically when you're playing and then kind of reconstructing it. So that was really great. The other two huge influences that had just a profound impact on my life to this day at U of I were my compositional mentor, was a Sicilian-born composer of pretty avant-garde 20th century music named Salvatore Martirano, Sal, as we all knew him. And Sal, one of the suggested conversation points that Gail hit me to was if I ever got any deeply profound advice from a mentor, maybe share that story. There was a night where there had been a party, and there were a few stragglers, including myself and Sal and a couple of other musicians. And it was very, very, very late. And we had been just hanging out and playing. There was an old upright piano in this place, but also Sal and my friends Dan and Brad were blowing on bottles and turning all sorts of things into percussion instruments. It was crazy. We had quite an amazing scene there, and we didn't realize how lucky we were at the time. This is in the early 80s in Champaign-Urbana, Illinois. And so we finally succumbed to the energy of needing to take a little bit of a break. We stepped outside, and Sal, when Sal had been, let's just say, enjoying himself, he used to almost get this kind of intense, you could almost see a mist in front of his eyes. He was a very intense guy. And he looked at me and he said, he's holding his beverage, and he says, yeah, you're a very talented young musician, player, but don't you forget, my favorite player in the whole world is me. That was Sal, and what he was communicating, and this is really important. What he was communicating was, if your own music isn't at the center of your objective, psychologically healthy esteem, if you want to put it that way, you have to love your own music. Uh, if you don't love your own music the most, then to Sal, there's something wrong with you. You know, what are you doing if your music isn't your favorite? Um, and that is deep. That is some profound stuff. Um, so that was Sal, and then the other huge influence um, was the director of the Illinois Jazz Bands, who was an amazing musical guru to many people, uh, named John Garvey. And I could talk just about Garvey for more than half an hour, but what I will say about Garvey was that the biggest thing that I learned from him, other than um, how to rehearse a band the right way, was was lessons that have become a linchpin of everything that I think and believe in about both performing and writing music, and that has to do with music's gesturality. Uh, the idea that musical phrasing should always be analogous to some sort of physical gesture. Um, so what that means is one of my favorite examples, and I mentioned this to my class when I'm teaching. You didn't hear the bassy band playing ba da ba da 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 ba da ba da 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 ba da, you know, just a simple background figure, but they play ba da ba da da ba da da da. There were emphases, there was shape. That was Garvey's philosophy about everything, and he would be rehearsing the band, and he would look at whatever section he was working with at that point, no doubt making some kind of point to them that he felt he'd made millions of times, and now he was having to make it again because they weren't translating um, inductively, I guess you'd say. He'd look at them and he'd say, "Look, there's 1,000 ways to play this wrong and only one way to play it right. Why burden yourself with all those choices? Just play it the right way and you won't have to make all those decisions." An oversimplification, but there it is. Anyway, I stayed in the college town a little bit longer than some would have. My family was there and I was very close to them. And it gave me a chance to sort of get my trio leading chops together and start getting my book together. But eventually in 1988, I moved to Chicago and things went really well for me there. And I would just share two of my early favorite memories are that I had a steady gig at the Green Mill, which is still, I think it's the greatest jazz club in the world. I'm admittedly biased, but I know some Jared, my drummer, always says, he goes, "Man, that's just the Mill is just the greatest jazz club in the world." So I had a steady gig at the Mill, and I hadn't even lived in Chicago for a week yet. So that was pretty cool. I went in there for a jam session the first Friday night after I'd moved to town, not knowing that they had recently, I was going to say lost, like they misplaced him. They'd recently made a change in the piano chair for the house band. It was a regular jam session, but there was a house group that got paid a little bit to be there, and they hadn't dealt with the piano chair. And so I sat in that night, and they said, "Hey, do you want to join the band?" And so having a steady gig at the Mill, and I hadn't even lived in town for a week yet, that was really amazing. And then not long after that, I met a few people, most notably Ed Peterson, amazing saxophonist and really intense composer, who was a Chicago stalwart, along with tenor saxophonists like Von Freeman, who I got to play with a lot, gentleman Eddie Johnson, who I got to play with a lot. But Ed had a regular Monday night band at the Green Mill, and I ended up joining that band, played in that band for 4.5 years. was also kind of during this time, early 90s we're talking about, that I met the great drummer Paul Wertico, who was still playing with Pat Metheny at that point and had been in Pat's band for many years. And we had a couple of different trios over the next few years. Most notably, there was one called Union Trio. We made some records for a UK-based label called Name. NAIM. It was a record label, audiophile record label that got started by a high-end audio company. And, the main thing I'll say about that is that being in the studio, especially with Paul, all the experience that he had with Metheny from all those years, I started really learning my way around the recording studio. And then the next big thing that happened, and I said something earlier about I'm probably best known for writing and arranging, but what I'm probably best known for is the 20 years that I spent working with the vocalist Kurt Elling. I met Kurt in 1993, and at that point he was still he wasn't even widely known locally in Chicago as much yet. He was working on it. He was tenacious and hungry, but we became friends and started kind of just hanging out, working on stuff. He'd come over and we'd play around with my 4-track cassette recorder. They used to have things like that. And the next thing you know, we've made a high quality, but nonetheless, we thought of it as a demo. Kurt gets signed to Blue Note, and they actually put out the demo with a few extra tracks. And we're kind of off to the races at that point. It was a pretty much of a Cinderella story. Ended up over a 20-year period making 6 records for Blue Note, 4 for Concord, so 10 total. They were all Grammy nominated. I got a couple of my own Grammy nominations for arranging over those years, and then we finally won a Grammy in 2010 for the Kurt Elling Live at Lincoln Center, the music of Johnny Hartman and John Coltrane for that project. And during that 20 years, that's, the 2 main things I would say about that are that we toured all over the world. I mean, we were on the road many of those years. It was over 200 nights a year. So that was intense. That was be careful what you wish for. And a lot of it, most of it, just loved it. I loved being on the road. That's what I had always wanted to do as a musician, if I could do it in a, let's just say, a premium situation. And that ended up being pretty cool. And the other thing I'll say about that is that it allowed me to develop and hone and sharpen my skills as both an arranger writer and also as a producer. I got to work with some of the great engineers, both recording, mixing, and mastering, and just really learned a lot about making music. I've always been a big ear person in terms of the importance of sound, the importance of quality sound. And when I was a tiny little kid, my Christmas present was always, my birthday's close to Christmas. And so I would combine Christmas and birthday presents and get something which, at least if you believe the story my parents were telling, a bigger something than I would normally get individually on those 2 occasions. And it was always an upgraded stereo or a bicycle. But usually I had the best little kiddie stereo that anybody could want. So sound's incredibly important to me. And the experiences I've had in the studio have taught me how to channel and focus that, work with engineers, and I'm really proud of the sound that we get on my records and that we get on the various projects that I now work on. So in 2013, my time with Kurt had sort of run its course. It was just a natural time for us to go different directions. And since then, I've been doing a lot of writing and producing for various artists. Alicia Olatuja, Carter Calvert, um, Barb Younger, the UK singer, fantastic. Recently did another project for Concord a couple years ago with Ariana Nykrug. And there's also an interesting project that I just did with Harvey Mason, the great drummer, for a heretofore unknown singer named Elliot Farmer, who lives in Rochester, New York. And that the release of that all got messed up by the pandemic. So we'll see what happens with that. Meanwhile, I'm always working on my own projects. Not long after parting ways with Mr. Elling, I made a trio record with John Patitucci and Kendrick Scott called Honor Thy Fathers, which I loved making it, loved playing with those guys, realized a lot of my trio arranging ambitions on that record. And around, kind of during that same period, I was when I was working with Gail and got my Yamaha artist endorsement relationship, which has turned out to be just a beautiful thing. I can't say enough about Yamaha Artist Services, and which is run by a wonderful, wonderful woman who's so supported in Bonnie Barrett, and they're just great. They're fantastic. I love being a Yamaha artist. So kind of evolving out of that, the project that won the Grammy that I mentioned before, the Coltrane Hartman project that was recorded live at Lincoln Center, involved string quartet. Writing for string quartet, I kind of fell back in love with doing that. String quartet is one of my absolute favorite palettes musically. So I started working on what became my next record, which is a record called Tessitura. It's for, music for my trio and for string quartet, and that came out in April of 2019, and that was a really fulfilling project for me. It took me into a depth of arranging and writing that I had not really explored either on my own behalf or writing for anybody else. Level of sort of compositional intricacy, and really cemented my relationship with my trio, with Jared and Matt. They're on that record, and they'll be on the next record. What I'm working on now is actually, so that was all arrangements of various standards, including I seem to have gotten a reputation for reimagining pop standards, especially from the era I mentioned, from the late 60s all the way through the 70s into the 80s. My attitude is the music of a lot of the music of people like Carole King and Burt Bacharach and Sting and Stevie Wonder and Paul Simon, and the list, it's a very heady list of people. Earth, Wind and Fire. I mean, come on, there's a lot of great songs there, and bringing them into the jazz fold, into the jazz canon, is really cool thing. So Tessitura has a lot of that, ranging from real sort of tried and true standards like Georgia on My Mind or Cole Porter's All of You, to Wichita Lineman, beautiful, beautiful song. That's I think one of the great American songs from any genre. I even did a full-blown version. This one arrangement took me a whole month to write, which was an arrangement of Sweet Judy Blue Eyes, Crosby, Stills and Nash, Stephen Stills song. So that was Tessitura, and that was all. The word some people use is covers. I don't like that word myself. and we don't even have time to talk about why I don't like it. But uh, my next project is going to be all original music. So maybe turn to just saying a few things about the pandemic and the way that has affected the situation. I am incredibly fortunate um, in a lot of different ways, but I had a lot of stuff canceled last spring. I was going to have an amazing spring. I had an Australian tour going on. Um, I had some great guest artists at jazz festival things lined up finally, and was going to be doing some teaching at some different colleges as well as my teaching at the new school. And of course, it all fell apart. But one of the things that I'm really, really fortunate uh, 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 regarding, in a sense that I've been in the profession long enough to have made some really amazing connections. When you play all over the world, you get to know people everywhere. Um, and so, just not to get into too much detail, but related to that, during the pandemic, I've ended up doing quite a bit of writing and producing and playing for virtual shows, a lot of private virtual shows. So, read between the lines. Yeah, it helps to, over the years, to have been blessed with uh, developing friendships with a lot of amazing people, some of whom are affluent and who, during this pandemic, have liked the idea of having sort of private shows. There have been some virtual shows that I've done that have been public. If you look on Facebook, I did a series of shows for Three Sticks Wines that were called Three Sticks Together, that were all fundraisers for musician relief. And between those three shows, we raised over $100,000 for a combination of music cares and a charity called Sweet Relief, I think is what it's called. Um, so I've been really, really lucky to continue working, and I mean, I see that we're who knew that I could talk for half an hour. Anybody that knows me did. But what I would say, and maybe some parting thoughts, especially one of the sort of conversation points that was mentioned, was any advice for young people. I'm admittedly prejudiced on this particular issue, but I'm a big proponent of music literacy. I'm a big proponent of expanding your skill sets beyond whatever may be the most immediate, which for most people is playing, working on a specific instrument. I think people should learn how to write for themselves. I think they should learn more than whatever they already know about theory and the nuts and bolts of music and how it works. Um, and and that's really the stuff that has allowed me to keep working at least enough to keep my head above water during this whole um, incredibly excruciating social experience that we're still in the middle of, and it's getting bad again, it seems like. So I continue to hope for collaborative work like that. Collaboration is incredibly important to me, and two heads are better than one. No matter how good the one head is, someone else is going to think of stuff you wouldn't think of. So collaborate and never stop studying music, never stop reading and practicing, and that's kind of an eternal message, I suppose. But that is my message, and hopefully I find a way to practice what I preach as much as I can. And it's been great being here to chat with you today from my studio, and I can't wait to be out there with the trio again soon, do some playing, and see people in person as opposed to giving Zoom more business. So thank you very much. And everybody, please take good care of yourselves and be careful. Wear a mask and use your noggin. We can get past this thing, but we have to be smart. And so that's something that matters a lot to me. People take care of themselves. All right. Well, thank you, and good evening.